Many Europeans are facing a difficult winter as energy prices soar due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Germany has granted a mothballed coal-fired power plant emergency permission to run until April, raising fears that reducing dependence on Russian gas is taking priority over fighting climate action.
Europe is facing a fresh energy crisis as Romania and Bulgaria scramble to save their Russian-owned oil refineries ahead of sweeping US sanctions set to take effect later this month.
France's Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu has resigned hours after his cabinet was unveiled. The Élysée Palace made the announcement after he met President Emmanuel Macron for an hour earlier this morning.
France burned through 4 prime ministers in a single year, which is quite a statement when you're supposed to be a major European power. But here's what makes this truly insane. This isn't chaos. This is the final act of a decision made in 2008 that everyone knew would end badly. After the financial crisis, world leaders faced a simple choice: stimulate your economy and invest in growth, or tighten belts to reduce deficits. The United States and China chose stimulus. Their economies reignited. Europe, led by Germany's obsession with balanced budgets, chose austerity instead. Nearly 2 decades later, that choice looks like one of the greatest acts of economic self-sabotage in modern history. Europe's share of global GDP collapsed from 20% in 2000 to just 14% by 2023. While its competitors were building the future, Europe was balancing budgets and cutting corners. The former European Central Bank chair called it what it is: an aging giant trapped in slow and agonizing decline. Here's something that reveals how broken this became. The average age of Europe's 5 largest companies is close to 100 years. In the United States, just under 40. Not a single European company worth more than 100 billion euros has been built from scratch in the last 50 years. Since 2008, about a third of Europe's most promising startups left the continent entirely. They moved to places where they could actually scale without drowning in regulations. Private sector investment tells the same story. European businesses spend just over 1% of GDP on research and development, barely half the level of the US. Combine that with a labyrinth of regulations and sky-high energy costs, and talent and capital keep fleeing to friendlier markets. The energy situation is where Europe's self-sabotage becomes almost comedic. When Russian gas supplies were cut off in 2022, Germany decided to decommission its remaining nuclear power plants. That decision crippled heavy industry, sent energy prices soaring, and made entire sectors uncompetitive overnight. You couldn't script a worse policy if you tried. Europe is bleeding talent. Millions of highly educated workers are heading to the US and UK in search of better opportunities. They're being replaced by lower-skilled migrants who rely on government support, straining welfare systems built by the very taxpayers now leaving. Meanwhile, about 100 million Europeans are at risk of falling into poverty. This economic decay produced a political consequence Europe's elites can no longer ignore: an angry, disillusioned electorate. When millions are struggling with rising costs and collapsing public services, people start demanding answers. Support for populist parties has tripled since the 1990s, from around 10% of the vote to nearly 30% today. In Germany, the far-right AfD has surged to become the main beneficiary of public anger. Much of that anger stems from expensive green policies, like the heating law that forced households to spend tens of thousands of euros installing heat pumps, even as major investors like BlackRock quietly distanced themselves from ESG. Brussels and Berlin kept doubling down. But the revolt isn't just about policy, it's about trust. Nearly a quarter of EU lawmakers have faced scandals ranging from harassment to full-blown bribery, cases that appear selectively prosecuted, with opposition politicians targeted more aggressively than establishment insiders. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's tenure has been marked by secrecy and evasion. Journalists demanded details about the multi-billion-euro Pfizer vaccine deal and were told there was no official record. The negotiations had been conducted over text message. To the average European, this looks less like governance and more like an elite bureaucracy closing ranks. Then came the final shock. Valentine's Day 2025. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance told European leaders that the transatlantic alliance could no longer be taken for granted. America's new priority isn't defending Europe, it's fighting cultural battles domestically. Vance refused to meet the German chancellor and instead sat down with the leader of the AfD. Leaked group chats revealed that Vance and his defense secretary reportedly said they hate bailing Europe out again, and called European allies freeloading and pathetic. The 80-year alliance that anchored Europe's security just ended with a text message leak, but the final crack in Europe's foundation runs through its currency. After Trump's foreign policy shakeup, Germany scrapped its debt limit and pushed through a €1 trillion stimulus. After decades of forcing austerity on everyone else, Germany just gave itself permission to borrow at will. Here's the problem. How can the European Central Bank set a single interest rate for a union where France's total debt sits above 350% of GDP, while Germany's is closer to 200%? The answer? It can't. To save France, the ECB would need to create sustained inflation around 6 to 7% for more than a decade to inflate away debt. But that's politically impossible. Why should Germans tolerate France's spending spree? Because the ECB can't solve it. The power to create money is quietly shifting back to national governments. 20 separate governments, each doing their own thing. That's the death of a single currency, and France might deliver the final blow. This October, its prime minister lasted 14 hours in office. Fitch downgraded France's credit rating, citing deep political paralysis. France runs a 6% budget deficit, double the EU limit, with new borrowing used just to refinance old debt. France's 10-year bond now yields about 3.5%. Its 30-year is above 4.3%. That's 8 times higher than during COVID. ECB President Christine Lagarde insists there's no rush to intervene. Markets are functioning fine. France just needs to stick to budget rules. But behind the tough talk, the ECB can't let France go under. Yet stepping in to save it could destroy the entire euro project. So what's the EU's plan? A two-pronged strategy to maintain control even as everything crumbles. First, the Savings and Investment Union. Officially about helping Europeans invest savings. Actually about funneling Europe's $10 trillion in household savings into EU-aligned assets. Workers will find their pensions quietly redirected into funds whose mandates align with Brussels' agenda. Retail investors asked to put life savings into illiquid investments with no liability if things go wrong. Second, the digital euro. The ECB's central bank digital currency isn't innovation, it's control. The Bank for International Settlements chief bluntly said central banks will have absolute control over how it's used. Limits on holdings, spending caps, the power to impose negative interest rates directly. Your balance could shrink in real time because the ECB decides to delete a portion of your savings unless you spend or invest in approved assets like green bonds. The euro is on borrowed time. The ECB is pretending it can enforce fiscal discipline while knowing it can't let France fail. The only thing keeping bond spreads from exploding is the market's belief that the ECB will eventually blink. But that belief is misplaced. As national governments take control of credit creation, the logical next step is capital controls. Stronger states forced to restrict the flow of newly created euros to weaker ones. The effective end of the single currency, even if the name remains. Europe chose austerity in 2008, while its competitors chose growth. That choice hollowed out its economy, radicalized its politics, lost its security guarantor, and broke its currency. The age of unified, Western-led Europe is fading, and the coming reset will either bring reform or ruin. Right now, it's looking a lot more like the latter.